Welcome to Faraday Churches. I'm Ruth Bancewicz, the Church Engagement Director at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion here in Cambridge. Our guest today is Dr. Markus Ong, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Engineering and Physics at Whitworth University. His scientific background is in materials science and engineering with a focus on nanomaterials. As Whitworth is a Christian university, he gets to help the students think about what it means to be a Christian in their field and how they can serve God with their work in the future. It was great to meet Markus this time last year on my sabbatical at Whitworth University, which is in Spokane in Washington State, in the far northwestern corner of the USA. Welcome, Markus.
Yeah.
And last year, Markus sent me an article he had written on engineering imperfections that actually brought a tear to my eye. I think I was a bit tired, but I think also it is really profound in a theological sense. That was a first for me with an academic paper. The full title was Redeeming and Sanctifying Engineering Imperfections. And hopefully, as our conversation goes on, you'll see why I find it moving. Our guest host today is Louise Davis, host of what used to be called Now There's a Thought podcast, but now has a longer name, which she can tell us, which deals with all things science and faith. She's also a translator and a general all-round fun and interesting person. Welcome, Louise, and tell us the name of your podcast.
Hi, I love that introduction. Can I take you around with me to introduce me to people all the time? That's great. Yeah, we're still Now There's a Thought, so that's the channel. The podcast is a podcast host, a pastor, and a guest walk into a bar. So you can find us by searching either of those if you're interested.
Great, thank you. So, Markus, is there anything else you want to tell us about yourself before we dive in?
So when I'm not doing all of the science and science and faith things, something on the side is I'm part of the Whitworth University Community Chorale, and so in the evenings I will go and sing with those people, and so that is something extra that I do on the side.
Great, great. We're hopefully all well-rounded people, and you certainly are. And also, just by way of introduction, Louise, how did you get into science and faith? Because I know your things is languages and translation and things like that. How did this topic grab you?
Yeah, it's not always obvious from the perspective of translator, is it? And actually, the basic answer is by accident. So your predecessor at the Faraday Institute, Ruth, handed our church a business card, and at some point our pastor went, can you do something with this? And Now There's a Thought was born. But it actually really suits me well because I enjoyed science at school, and I actually do work with science. I translate science, mostly pharmaceuticals, and it gives me that outlet for that. And it's that kind of idea of messing around with ideas and trying to find solutions and explanations, which is actually pretty much what translation is as well. And then taking that from there, if we're really serious about all of life, all of the world being belonging to God, then we have to start looking at that really fascinating overlap of, okay, well, how is this science God's, and what does it reveal to me about who God is? What does God say about what we do with science? And so, yeah, it's a really natural kind of overlap for me as a Christian, I think.
Great, thank you. So, introduction's over. Markus, can you just give us summarize in a couple of minutes the science that was in that article about engineering imperfections? There were different kinds of engineering imperfections and how engineers interact with them.
Yeah, so the paper is looking at how good design redeems and sanctifies things that we might naturally regard as imperfections or flaws. And I explore this from some different perspectives. One is just everyday product designed by engineers, and another is a microscopic view from a material science standpoint. In all of these perspectives, we find that these imperfections are ubiquitous everywhere. But good design not only uses the things that have these imperfections, it can also use these perceived imperfections themselves as the means to enable the desired attributes of a system. So for example, from a material science perspective, imperfections are practically unavoidable at the atomic level. For example, there's no such thing as pure gold, maybe 99.999%. But of course, that still leaves a lot of atoms that are not gold in there for any macroscopic piece of gold that you might find. And even if you had this 99.999% pure gold, you wouldn't use it for something like jewelry because it would be too soft and not durable enough, unless you alloy it with other atoms. And now it's not as pure as it was, but it is more functional. Similarly, something like steel is more structurally useful than pure iron. And it's because of the carbon atoms that interfere with the otherwise perfect crystalline structure that you might get for iron. And then some examples from maybe everyday engineered an example from everyday engineered products might be something like a fuse or a circuit breaker. It's designed to create a fault to prevent an electrical circuit from operating as it otherwise might, because it needs to do that so that you can keep an electrical system safe. Another example might be a manufactured defect or a flaw in food packaging so that you can open the container when you want to. And that mechanical failure is necessary and the defect is intentional. Otherwise, you have a very frustrating experience with a food or a beverage package.
I have to say one of my definitions of old, which I fall into now, is being unable to open packaging. It's obvious to anyone under the age of 40. So
In our home, we say, oh yeah, it's childproof.
okay.
So even when the grown-ups can't open it.
Brilliant. Excellent. So those are examples of, I think for me, thinking of engineers, I always think of this extreme precision, which is what you're talking about actually, but we might not normally think of building in weaknesses. Or I think later on you were talking about how you might actually put flaws in, or you've just talked about packaging, but also making something rougher or I think some of that was surprising to me. I don't know if you've got any questions, Louise, about the science.
About the science, I feel like you're on my level with how we've explained it in terms of, you have to introduce the flaw, like for a fuse, like you said, so that it would break when you need it to break. And having that weakness is a useful thing. And for me, I wonder if this introduces questions of what we consider pure, like how useful is purity in some ways. And then how kind of you have all these theological ideas of like strength and weakness, or I guess strength and weakness is a really useful one to think about in terms of packaging design and a fuse. The strength of that design is that it has weakness.
Yes. Yeah, so we can begin to see where the theological points are going to come. So before we anticipate you too much, Markus, do you want to share where you took this forward with some theological thoughts?
Yeah, so I think most of the time we are used to looking at God's wonderful design manifest through good and beautiful and quite frankly, things that we find enjoyable for ourselves. And maybe we don't think as much about God as designer when we're faced with difficulties in a broken world. But I think we should, because it can give us hope that we need during those trying times. So then what does it look like to think about God as a sovereign designer in our lives? And so as I was exploring this idea, I started seeing these themes repeated over and over in scripture. And quite frankly, a lot of them didn't even make it into the paper. I just had room for some of them. Some of my favorites, I think, are in John 9, we have the disciples asking Jesus about the blind man, why was this man born blind? Or maybe it's Paul talking about the thorn in his flesh in 2 Corinthians 12. And it's really evident to these observers that there's imperfections and flaws in this world. And in pretty much all of these cases, these things have a larger purpose. And a theme that I found running through a lot of these stories is it enabled God's people to worship and glorify him more. And I think at the pinnacle of all of this terribleness that we can find is really Jesus' death on the cross, right? We have somebody who is innocent and he's being condemned and murdered by violent sinners who had in fact engineered the state-of-the-art, most horrible way to make somebody suffer and die. And so it doesn't really get any worse than that. And even this atrocity is used by God as the very centerpiece of his demonstration of his love and grace for his people, so that they can be enabled to worship and glorify him more.
Yeah, yeah. And I think and the other one that I've been dwelling on recently is treasure in jars of clay. That I think it is countercultural because we're so, especially in a university environment, where everyone is striving to be their best, or many environments in the world, people are striving to be their best. Weaknesses are not something we say thank you for. Whereas trying to learn to say thank you for weaknesses, or look at those limitations as maybe not just, I think in your paper you were talking about flaws that are there are mistakes or flaws that are, I mean, like the engineer's flaws that are just who we are, yeah, and that those design flaws, if you like, to be very careful, and it's always probably very difficult to distinguish between those two different kinds of weaknesses in our lives, to be able to recognize those limitations as a welcome reason to help us to serve God better in one way or another. That's really, really hard. And I think that's what I found really moving, was here is a reminder that, these limitations or struggles are not because there's something wrong. Well, there is something wrong in a sense, but it doesn't have to limit our ability to serve God. I'm struggling to even articulate it because we don't talk about this kind of stuff very much. I don't know if you want to add anything in, Louise, sort of reflections from your perspective.
Yeah, I think in terms of where you're talking about a example of that I know I've experienced and a few people have experienced, is that kind of moment when your body fails you and you have that weakness and you get ill or you get an injury and you're forced to sit still for a bit, and that's a time when perhaps God really speaks to you, or it's really useful reflective time for you, and God has really used the physical weakness that we have in those situations. And I think those instances, they can be really difficult, and they can be a little more obvious. And I'm glad, Markus, that you brought up, especially in the run up to Easter, of course, the idea of the crucifixion, because I know in your article you were talking about the difference between the two types of failure, like you were saying, Ruth, with what is simply where we run out of strength and it's not sinful in any way, we're not doing anything wrong, but then also the imperfections that are literally sinful. And that can be a little bit even harder to think about because they're not desirable things in any way. The people who killed Jesus were not in any way acting in a good way. That was not the right thing for them to do, and yet in some way it was, because God was able to use it. And I think that's just an incredible, the ultimate example of a way to look at God using our absolutely imperfections, our imperfect behavior. I was I don't know, I was trying to think of more kind of everyday ways to apply that, but I don't know, perhaps you guys have some, but on some level I don't know if it's even necessary, because that's just such a all encapsulating example.
I think it's helpful in all of our everyday struggles, whether they be big or whether they be small, whether they be our fault or not our fault, or anything that we can handle or do. I mean, we can always go back and look at the example of what it looked like when Jesus faced these things. And so on the one hand, yeah, you can say it's, this all encapsulating thing, but uh, it's also something that is you can apply this to lots of things that you encounter in your life. We are given this example so that we can um, have that as something that we can look at as something that we want to be like, um,
Yeah.
and so there's lots of chances for us to apply that in whatever we might be facing.
Can you step us through an example, Markus, of how you might do this?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that helps me, and this is true for either I feel very finite today and I wish I could do this and that, and I'm not going to get to all of it. And it is equally true in, oh, wow, I have just done or not done something that, and that's really bad. And we can just unequivocally call that sin. Um, and one of the things that is often helpful for me in the midst of those situations is to take just a little bit of a break and say, this is a good thing for me. It helps me remember to be humble. It helps me to remember that, in fact, I'm not God. I think that really is maybe one of the most useful things of anybody's sin, because it's really very much in your face that you're not God, and that's really important um, for somebody like, well, me or you or anybody else, because sometimes the temptation is to think that, actually I can have it all together and I can take care of this, and people should do what I want them to do, and that's not true. And so those things are a blessing, because it reminds me of what actually is true, and it gives me um, a proper dose of humility. And as Ruth was describing earlier, it enables that thankfulness. And as we saw from the scriptural examples, it really is something that should be pushing us to worship God the way that we ought to.
Yeah. And can I ask, Markus, where did this come from?
It is a combination of things I have learned along the way of life, as I've encountered things that I have found difficult, as I have encountered things that are um, flawed, or what I would consider to be flawed. Um, and it's combining that with things that I teach as I do these engineering classes, and my background is in material science. When I did my PhD research, I worked in a lab where we were looking at reliability of materials, and we were measuring things like crack growth rates and fracture energies of materials, because we wanted to know if they were going to be reliable. So sometimes we didn't want them to fail. and at times we also wanted to know, how can I make these things fail at exactly the right time and at the right place? And how can I design it to do that? And so it's really a combination of all of those things. And during my time at Whitworth, I've taught a class that we've called Epic Failures in Engineering. And so we do case studies uh, of some well-known disasters that have happened. And so this was sort of a combination of all of those things put together.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And Louise, I don't know if you can see where you would you use this engineering analogy as a sort of illustration in church life in some way? Do you think this is translatable?
Oh, for sure. I mean, in some of the ways that we've already talked about, in terms of, how much strength we have and God being able to use when we don't have the strength, or in terms of appreciating how God can actually use the sinful moments. While we were thinking of that, I did actually think of a smaller example where I think, you know, at times when I might have said something that I would regret, but actually it's helped somebody. Um, there can be that kind of thing. So I think it's really useful to think about it in those ways of like, is this, is it an inherent kind of weakness, like you would have a weakness in a material? And these are, God-given materials as well. Perhaps in some way we're a bit like that. Or errors and those kinds of things. I think it's a really useful way to think. And I think I don't know, Marcus, you can tell me if I'm taking it one step too far. Uh, but talking about introducing impurities for strength, for me, that's a really cool symbol of diversity and bringing different people together to create something that's actually stronger, and that God can use as well.
What do
Yeah,
you think, Marcus?
and and I think yeah, I know Ruth has been thinking about this quite a bit as well, going all the way back to some of our planning for this. Um, and it's definitely true. I think another thing that is helpful from an engineering design perspective is that sometimes users might think that a particular feature is a flaw. And sometimes it's because they don't understand the design or the designer. And so sometimes when I look at something and I might say, oh, well, this is no good, or I don't understand it. The difference between this is terrible versus I don't understand it is sometimes my opinion of the designer. And I think that's a useful way for us to think about what our lives look like sometimes, because there are times where I it's really good for me to confess that I do not always understand all of God's design or why it worked the way that it did. When we think about what happened with Jesus on the cross, I would imagine that most of his disciples did not actually think that that was a great idea, and they certainly didn't behave that way.
That's a fair observation.
Yeah, and I definitely think God doesn't work in ways we would. In fact, he often lets things happen. Yeah, we would definitely not. But in his wisdom. Sorry, I don't know if you're about to say something, Louise, but yeah, that is just that's kind of my overarching feeling for this theme, that God and his wisdom works very differently to the way that we would if we were God.
Absolutely. I was just trying to think of a kind of user example to illustrate Marcus's point. I know you have one in your article, so but certainly when I was trying to set up on Zoom, so the bit that listeners won't have experienced was my laptop decided it wasn't playing ball, and so now we're on my phone for this conversation, and I can't for the life of me find the mute and unmute button on my phone, and I'm sure that the designers have put it somewhere that seems very logical and that they have a reason for, but I have no clue. And yes, that does sometimes feel like how God can act. There was a reason. He's definitely thought it through, but I can't find it.
Yeah, yeah. And there's so much in this about design and suffering and, big themes that could be taken further, and hopefully people will, and maybe you will, Marcus, in time. But just as we begin to close, maybe we can, I don't know if we can each think of an example of a place where we have realized that we have found the button, if you see what I mean. We realized why why God has allowed this to happen, or possibly why God has allowed this to happen. And we can see in a place where other people may say is wrong, that it's serving God better. I mean, for example, I'm single. That was never the plan. But I know from experience, and hopefully you do too, as two married people, having a mixture of people in the church is very powerful. It reminds us that no, we're definitely not all the same. We all have very different lifestyles. We have to make an effort to include each other, and that cuts both ways. Single people having a large family over, or a family remembering there are people in the world who don't have to put kids to get to bed by 8 o'clock or whatever, might want to chat. Yeah, I think it makes us so much stronger. And I still don't want to be in that position, being the different one. But while I am, yeah, no, people are welcome to, have me over and cook me dinner, let me play with the kids. So just put that out there. So, and who's next?
I really appreciated what you shared about the passage from First Corinthians about everybody is part of the body of Christ, whether they be the strong members or what we think of as weak members, and how they're also essential. And it got me thinking about not just the spiritual body of Christ, but to connect this with some of the Easter things that we've mentioned earlier, the physical body of Jesus, because the glaringly obvious physical flaws would be things like the wounds and scars from the crown of thorns, or nails from the cross, or the thrust of a spear. Um, and we would say that those would be indicating weakness, but in his resurrected body, in fact, those are the exact things that made doubting Thomas worship him in John 20. That's how he was identified. And again, in Revelation 5, you have the identifying description of the one who is worthy to open the scroll is a lamb standing as if it had been slaughtered. And so these death marks have this part to play in identifying that the lamb is worthy of worship. And so when I think of all of the things that we might consider weaknesses through the spiritual body of believers, like that should, not just in spite of the weakness, but perhaps because of the weaknesses, be pointing people again to the proper place of worship. And so I really think that's just such a wonderful way to think about the body of Christ, and how we all have our own different contributions to it. And just because it looks like it's weakness, even that can be the thing that points people to worship God.
Yeah, and with a massive caveat that it only works if we look after each other. So no one is left struggling with suffering or disability. It works when we include each other. Yeah. Louise.
Absolutely. I feel like I'm about to be a lot less profound, but perhaps it's still useful in that I think when we have assumptions about what we expect of people, and they're not always handled with the most grace, that can be very difficult. I would definitely describe that as imperfect. So to make that a bit more concrete, I'm from a church tradition where your typical worship would involve arms in the air, and it's very enthusiastic, and that is wonderful. But I don't typically express myself like that. And so I've come across people who would assume that I'm not a very spiritual person. And, I've missed out sometimes on opportunities to make contributions or to have really positive conversations with people because they assume that I'm not the person for that conversation. I'm not spiritual enough. But on the flip side of that coin, it has caused me to assess how I express myself in worship and to really open up a load of different channels and to think about different ways to worship, which is great for me to have all of those outlets. And it also then gives me something that I have to offer in a church setting in order to show other people that, hey, there's all of these different ways to worship and to connect with God. So yeah, even though it comes from that place of like that quite awkward and difficult interaction where you feel misunderstood, there's still an outlet to bring something into that situation, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And some of the quite profound things about the way we were made. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And sometimes, yeah, sometimes that's hard and sometimes that's good, but mostly both. Thank you so much. I feel like there's so much we could talk about, but we try and keep these podcasts to about half an hour or thereabouts. It's been fantastic to have you both on the podcast. Thank you, Louise, for coming as my co-host. If anybody wants to explore more, I will include a link to Markus's article in the show notes. You can check out previous episodes and supporting resources on Spotify, YouTube, Patreon, and the Faraday website. To help continue our work, you can support us on Patreon or make a donation. And finally, if you want to be part of our network, you can sign up for the Faraday Church's monthly-ish newsletter or weekly WhatsApp. And for details of all of these things, please go to faraday.institute/churches. See you next time.